Right, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, this afternoon. As I said, my name's Sonia Dunlop. I'm a senior policy advisor here at E3G. I lead our work on public banks. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, wherever you are in the world. This is a webinar to present the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix, which is our new online tool, and we'll be putting the URL in the chat in a moment. Zach, if you would be able to do that, thank you. So you can also explore it at your own leisure, but this is a tool to introduce you. This is a webinar to introduce you to our new tool on climate ambition and Paris alignment at public banks and the multilateral development banks in particular. E3G is a global climate change think tank, a global independent climate change think tank. It starts for third generation environmentalism. We have offices in London, Brussels, Berlin, Washington, DC, Dublin, and we have staff all over the world, including in Tokyo, in Maputo, in Cape Town, and in various in Budapest and in many other locations around the world. And we have for a long time been working within our sustainable finance program on climate ambition at international financial institutions and public banks. And the tool that we're going to present to you today, the E3G Climate Tracker Matrix, is really the result of 3 years of work and 3 years of research, building on our approach to Paris Agreement alignment at an MDB and at public banks, and our assessment of the degree of Paris Agreement alignment at those banks. So it's great to have you with us. I have with me today the E3G Public Bank team who are going to be presenting the various banks today. We have Zach Malik, Johannes Schruten, and James Hawkins, and many, many others across E3G have also supported this work across the years and across the last few months. And what we're going to present to you is both our approach of how our suggested approach about how to think about Paris Agreement alignment at a public bank, any public bank, whether that be multinational, bilateral, national, or even subnational, and also our updated assessment, detailed updated assessment on how the most famous of those public banks, the multilateral development banks, are doing on Paris alignment. So if I scroll down, you will see the list of banks that are covered in this tool, and today we're going to be covering doing a deep dive into the Asian banks amongst them. So there are eight banks really in total covered in the tool so far. We do hope to add more in the coming months and years, but today we will be looking in detail at Asian Development Bank, the ADB, African Development Bank, AfDB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and Islamic Development Bank, or the IsDB. So the 3 Asians, and of course the African Development Bank as well. If you scroll down, you will see that this is the color-coded matrix table, which summarizes the conclusions of our research. And just to say, we did a webinar week before last looking at the other institutions such as EIB, EBRD, IDB, and the World Bank, and that webinar will be coming to a YouTube channel near you very soon. But this is the main summary of our research. And if you want to tweet about this at any point, you can use the hashtag E3G Bank Climate Track. So what you see here along the very left-hand side are the 6 building blocks, the six-part approach to Paris alignment that the MDBs, that the multilateral development banks have defined so far. Those are climate finance, climate risk and adaptation, internal activities, mitigation, engagement and policy support, and reporting. And what we have done is we have broken these down in a non-exhaustive list of 15 more detailed metrics of Paris alignment, where we really go into detail and we try to get more granular to look at what does it really mean for one of these banks to become totally aligned with the Paris Agreement, and what do we need to be looking for. So we look at how they're promoting the greening of financial systems in the countries they work in. We're looking at, and in the regions they work in as well, we look at the ratio of non-fossil to fossil energy finance and the scaling up of climate finance in general. We look at how they're using nature-based solutions, how they're incorporating climate risk and resilience and adaptation, how they are integrating climate change and Paris alignment in their overarching institutional strategy, how good their standalone climate strategy is, if they have one, how they're integrating climate change in their sectoral strategies like water, energy, transport, urban strategies, and so on. And so we have 15 different metrics. I won't go through them all, but you can see we've really tried to break this down and look into detail. And we've broken this down into the 8 or 9 banks. And so each one of these boxes here takes you to more detail. So if, for example, if I click on promotion of green finance for ADB, you will see you then go to a summary of our top line assessment of ADB on that. And we do consider ADB to be Paris aligned in terms of how they're promoting the greening of financial systems, and then a detailed explanation with lots and lots of links to all the different sources we consulted in order to make this assessment, and lots of details, and in many cases also some recommendations about how the bank can improve even further. If I just go back to the main page, you will also see here that if you click on the E3G metrics for Paris alignment, you will see in one page a summary of all our metrics of Paris alignment. And in this diagram, it's not very clear, I know. Please do zoom in at home if you can. But we have tried to compare the approach to Paris alignment at the 9 multilateral development banks that are working together on this, at the 25 or so members of the International Development Finance Corporation that have also committed to Paris alignment. These are the national bilateral development finance institutions and their approach to Paris alignment. The 15 European development finance institutions that have also just committed to Paris alignment and come up with their own framework, and then mapped that onto E3G's 15-part framework for Paris alignment. And if you scroll down, you will see that for each one of these metrics, we have defined 4 different levels of Paris alignment: unaligned, some progress, Paris aligned, and then that dark green category, transformational, which we think is actually going beyond Paris alignment, going beyond just getting your own house in order, but really being a transformational leader of the transition to a climate safe world in that country or region. And you can see all this detail as well. Furthermore, if you click on the names of the actual metrics, so say you're interested in energy access, then you will also be able to see, again, the definitions of the 4 levels of Paris alignment for that metric, in this case, energy access and fuel poverty, and then also a detailed deep dive into why we chose that metric, what we were looking for, how we defined it, and how it could evolve in the future. So lots of background on our methodology there as well. Furthermore, if you're interested in a particular bank, so say you're working for the Islamic Development Bank and you want to see what our overall assessment of the Islamic Development Bank was, you can click on Islamic Development Bank and you get in one page an overview of that bank with a bit of background information, a summary of where we think they're at in their journey towards full Paris alignment, and then a table, which in one table just overviews and outlines where we think they're doing well, the areas marked in green, where they're made some progress, orange, and where we believe they're still unaligned, which we have marked in red. So that gives you a overall picture together with some recommendations and where we think they're really showing leadership. So that's a bit of an overview of how this tool works. We're very keen to get all comments all feedback, where if you think our assessments are right, if you think they're wrong, if you think we've been too harsh or too lenient, let us know. Let us know how we can improve this to make it more useful to you. Let us know if you like it. Let us know if you don't like it. You know, we're very, very open to all comments, and you can actually email us at banktrack@e3g.org, or email any individual members of the team in order to let us know more. Few other things I wanted to say, that we want this to also be a tool to understand which areas should be prioritized in each one of the MDBs in order to complete this journey to full Paris Agreement alignment. And indeed, if you look at this color-coded table, you will see that even the MDBs that are maybe, slightly ahead in this journey, no single MDB can be said to be fully Paris aligned yet, according to our criteria and our approach to Paris alignment. And so we hope this allows both people inside and outside the banks, government, shareholders, journalists, rating agencies, you name it, civil society organizations, to be able to see at a glance, in an easily understandable way, the areas where we think there needs to be more work done, and the areas where the different banks can be said to be best practice leaders, and where other banks should be seeking to copy their work in that area. We can also see that some metrics are doing better than others. So in terms of promoting the greening of financial systems, we think the MDBs are broadly doing a pretty good job. As you can see, this one is really pretty green across the board. The goal is to get every light on this dashboard to flash green over the next year or two. Whereas there are other metrics, such as, for example, the ratio of the scaling up of climate finance and the ratio of fossil to non-fossil energy lending, or the integration of climate into sectoral strategies, transport, water, or the implementation of fossil fuel exclusion policies. These are the areas where broadly we've seen slightly less progress, perhaps because they're also institutionally difficult, internally difficult, politically difficult, and that also gives you a good feel for what needs to be prioritized across the board. A few last things before I hand over to my colleagues to do their deep dives into the individual banks, which I'm sure is what you're all waiting for. We are hoping to add more banks to this tool over the next months and years. So far we have focused on multilateral development banks, but we are very keen to also apply this analysis, and we have already applied this analysis to national bilateral development finance institutions. We have already done this analysis, for example, on China Development Bank, Japan International Cooperation Agency, and Korea Development Bank. Maybe someone can put a link in the chat actually to that report called Banking on Asia, but we are hoping to digitalize that as well and add that to this tool in the coming months. And we're also looking to do this analysis on a number of other banks. And if you have any banks you want to suggest, or indeed if you have any banks that you want to fund us to assess, let us know. But we are looking to also do this on KfW, on AfD, on CDC from the UK, so some of the European ones, and also from other banks around the world. We're also looking to add further metrics to our framework for assessing Paris Agreement alignment. There's a lot missing that we haven't covered yet. We haven't covered just transition, for example. We haven't really done a deep dive into the requirements placed on financial intermediaries and counterparties, a very important area. We need to do more to really understand how the responses to the COVID-19 crisis have been Paris aligned or not. So we are looking to also expand this in terms of the topics that we analyze for each one of these banks. And if you have suggestions, just let us know. We will be continually updating this. This will be a live tool with continual updates as new information comes out, as new policies are announced and confirmed, as new decisions are made by the banks in question, and as there operations evolve over time. And so let us know if you think any of it is out of date. We are looking to really update it almost on a live monthly basis. So this should be a continually up-to-date tool for you to use, an encyclopedia of what public banks are doing on climate change and on Paris Agreement alignment, all part of shifting financial flows to low carbon and climate resilient development. So let us know any comments, let us know any questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. We're really keen to hear from you. And I'm not sure which bank we want to start with today, but Zach says you're going to be presenting ADB, AIIB and Islamic Development Bank. Zach, do you want to kick us off with your first bank?
Thanks, Sonia, for that comprehensive overview. And yeah, sure, I can kick us off with ADB. Let me just share my screen.
Over to you.
Let me just, hopefully everyone can see my screen now. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Zach. I'm a researcher working in the International Financial Institutions team at E3G. And I'll begin by introducing our deep dive into the Asian Development Bank. The Asian Development Bank is the regional bank of Asia that's been instrumental in development as well as sustainable development since its inception. In terms of Paris alignment, the ADB has made some progress on alignment with the Paris Agreement and is beginning to integrate climate change across its operations. In our review, the overall commitment and direction has been set. The challenge now is to make sure that what's been set or committed to translates into action, and that's being monitored and progress is being pushed on that front. And we see at the moment that the bank now needs to focus on improving its non-fossil fossil energy ratio, the bank's fossil fuel exclusion policies, which will be very important given the ADB energy policy review is currently happening. Consultation is happening on that, so it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Energy efficiency standards and inclusion of mitigation and adaptation in its transport, water, city, and energy strategies. And under this context, we outlined a couple of recommendations. The first, and perhaps the obvious one, is making sure that the ADB should use the forthcoming energy policy review to set a target date for 100% of its energy lending to be zero carbon energy projects, phasing out support for unabated fossil related projects. Moreover, the ADB needs to make energy efficiency an infrastructure priority and should consider setting a specific energy efficiency lending target, which excludes energy efficiency improvements of fossil fuel infrastructure. And lastly, the ADB should ramp up its technical assistance to financial regulators in Asia to promote or better promote green national financing strategies for mitigation and adaptation. As Sonia mentioned in her introduction, this is kind of the overview table. As you can see, there are several metrics where we've considered the ADB as Paris aligned, with one or two perhaps at the moment being unaligned, and we hope that this will change over the course of the months and years. But there are several which are sort of sitting at some progress, and similarly we'd like that to sort of change for the better and move towards Paris aligned, if not transformational, over the coming months and years. I would like to take this opportunity to focus on a couple of the metrics, so just do a bit of a zoom on how we've come to those assessments. The first one is that I want to focus on is promotion of green finance. As we mentioned at the beginning, ADB is considered Paris aligned on this metric. We see that ADB is helping to drive a green bond market through its issuance and its support of other issuers. But obviously at the moment, it seems to be less clear to what extent the ADB is working with regulators on green finance. And the way we've divided this metric is looking at the green bond market and then sort of looking into how the bank is supporting the greening of the financial system. So on the green bond market, briefly, the ADB has launched a green bond program in 2015 with a $500 million green bond. It's at different moments in time, issued a variety of different bonds, a variety of different amounts throughout the region. And the critical thing here is it's identifying barriers to the green bond market, and that's being supported by the ADB. So really sort of breaking down those barriers, understanding how green bond issuance can be accelerated, and making sure that those use of proceeds are related to sustainable development, specifically climate change on the adaptation and mitigation side. In terms of greening the financial system, the ADB has also provided assistance development through green financial product institutions, MFIs, and a good example of this was MFIs were offered energy efficient homes in Pakistan. However, only a small number of individual projects are listed for MFI assistance. Another interesting project related to green finance includes the technical support to Punjab National Banks to build institutional capacity on rooftop solar investment, as well as a project in Thailand aiming to show the viability of non-subsidized solar power. So these are kind of the few examples where we really thought that the ADB was taking a leading role in greening the financial system, but also making sure that it's also acting as a leader when it comes to the green bond market. And just to close on this metric, there's obviously a case that we looked into related to partial credit guarantee for geothermal in the Philippines. And our understanding is that the market failure trying to be addressed with what was happening with the ADB in this project is tapping into new capital sources, i.e. institutional investors. So that's where ADBs did really well. In terms of where perhaps some progress further progress needs to be made, is what we think is the fossil fuel exclusion policies. Our overall assessment is some progress because oil and gas exploration is excluded, but at the moment, there's no official coal exclusion policy. And then we've broken it down in terms of coal policies, upstream oil policies, downstream oil and gas policy, and supply side energy efficiency. And we've provided a detailed explanation or an elaborate explanation on how we've come to our conclusions. So for example, on coal, the ADB does not have an official coal exclusion policy. The current energy policy, so the 2009 energy policy, states that the ADB will selectively support coal-based power projects if cleaner technologies are adopted and adequate mitigation equipment and measures are incorporated in the project design. But as we've said, this policy is currently being reviewed, and hopefully the formal position will change within the bank, and hopefully our assessment will too as a consequence. And it's also important to note on the coal front that even though the last coal project was, we're still unclear what the formal position is, which is why we've given it the assessment we've given it. And on terms of oil and gas, the bank will continue its policy of not finding any oil and gas exploration projects because of the associated risks. But it's interesting to note that therefore the exclusion policies on oil and gas are somewhat more extensive than their official policy on coal. And just to close, in terms of supply side energy efficiency, the ADB does not require an emissions performance standard for its lending, but it is interesting to note that the ADB follows the IFC environmental health and safety guidelines. But our recommendation on this sub-metric, if we can call it that, is for the ADB power generation energy efficiency to include robust life cycle emission performance standards. So that's kind of the deep dive summary or overview of the ADB. I'm happy to pick up on any questions in the Q&A, but also in the discussion as towards the end of our presentation. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to you, Sonia. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Zach. That was a really good overview of Asian Development Bank based in Manila, one of the more well-established multilateral development banks operating in Asia. And really good to see the areas where ADB is obviously doing well and also where it's doing less well. I just wanted to say also that so this the content of what you're seeing today has been reviewed by a suite of external reviewers from civil society and from academia as well, who have kindly taken the time to review it and give their comments, which we have incorporated. And it has also been reviewed by staff within the multilateral development banks concerned, who took a long time to really go through everything in detail, provide their comments, provide their feedback, in some cases, make the argument that they perhaps should be graded more favorably. And we have gone through that in detail, incorporated that, made our own independent judgment in each case, to make sure that this is really as a quality piece of work, or as quality as we can possibly make it. I also wanted to just say that obviously there is also an official joint MDB Paris Agreement alignment process ongoing, has been going since over the last 5 years, and that's something we're following closely, and we hope that this is also a contribution to that process and to the marketplace of ideas on public bank Paris alignment, and so we're keen to also raise awareness of that and feed into that as well. So next, I suggest we maybe go back to Zach to do Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a much newer bank, and then we move to African Development Bank and Islamic Development Bank. Zach, are you all right to present AIIB again? AIIB?
Yeah, sure,
Brilliant.
no problem. Thanks, Sonia. I'm happy to walk through our overview and analysis of the AIIB. Yeah, as Sonia mentioned, the AIIB is amongst the newest multilateral development banks. It was created after the Paris Agreement, and therefore we believe it has the opportunity to fully integrate the commitments to the Paris Agreement goals, but also look to its peer MDBs to sort of understand and have better know-how of some of the best practices when it comes to doing so. However, as you see, there are several areas of improvement across all of the metrics that we looked into, and you can see for reasons I'll explain later that some of them are not aligned on most indicators, and this is partially because of the infancy of the institution, and we appreciate and we understand and we're conscious of the fact that, I guess, relative to the other MDBs, the processes of putting the policies are still ongoing and still being revised and still being updated, and much more live in that sense. And so the areas to prioritize would be sort of creating a standalone climate strategy, project level reporting of GHG emissions, developing fossil fuel exclusion policies, and implementing or having an implementation of a climate risk framework. So against this background or backdrop, we've out several recommendations. The first one being that the AIIB should create a standalone climate change strategy. So that fully links to its recently published corporate strategy. And that the AIIB should look into further climate risk management systems across its portfolio and establish a project level climate risk process. The AIIB should also actively seek to translate its management's position on fossil fuels, specifically coal, into its official lending policy. And lastly, the AIIB should consider setting up technical assistance programs, including climate-related technical assistance to address upstream barriers in client countries. So with that in mind, I just want to quickly show you the overview table. And as you can see, and as I mentioned earlier, that several of our metrics that we looked into as part of our research are aligned. But like I said, this is obviously a combination of the bank being relatively newer, policies and processes are still being in place, or they're yet to mature to really quantify what's been happening. And obviously over time, we'll make sure to follow and keep a track of what's happening since that policy has been put in place or being announced. And hopefully we can quickly and accordingly change the metrics that need to be changing and hopefully ultimately ending up as Paris-aligned. Just like I did for the previous bank, the ADB, I just want to focus to expand on thinking. The first one is sort of standalone climate strategy, integration of climate in overarching strategy. As I mentioned, we thought that this was unaligned. The AIIB, does not have a standalone climate strategy. The corporate strategy briefly mentions climate change, but alignment with the Paris Agreement or language to align with the Paris Agreement is currently missing. So we broke this up in the standalone climate strategy, which the AIIB currently does not have, and its overarching strategy. So the AIIB corporate strategy, published this year in September, briefly mentions climate change, and alignment with the Paris Agreement is currently missing. So the overarching strategy, so the mission of the AIIB is to be lean, clean, and green, and we understand that one of the thematic priorities is sustainable infrastructure, with the aim to green infrastructure and support countries to meet their environmental development goals, which this is very promising. And the AIIB sort of mentions loosely, admittedly, climate change in its corporate strategy. And so this is an area where maybe this could be explored or revised going forward to really strengthen the relationship with the mission, but also sort of the thematic priorities. Having said that, the AIIB corporate strategy did reiterate the bank's goal to achieve 50% share of climate finance by 2025 in its financing approvals. And this is also aligned with its energy sector strategy, which is very promising. And while the bank did sort of mention certain climate change priorities, it's yet to be seen how that will come into fruition. And we'll obviously keep a close eye on how things progress over time. So yeah, ultimately we want the bank to publish as soon as possible a detailed roadmap and timeline for the bank to achieve full Paris Agreement alignment, as other MDBs such as EIB and EBRD have done so. Our view is that the bank does not have to wait for the joint MDB Paris alignment and just on the standalone climate strategy, the AIIB should consider developing a standalone climate strategy, but that clearly outlines how it will align itself with the Paris Agreement. So I'm going to move swiftly on to another metric is to be made, and there's a lot of opportunity to really keep momentum on this metric, and hopefully move towards Paris aligned. So this is sort of institutional leadership and information sharing, and we've given it some progress because the bank has the potential to introduce transformational practices amongst the MDBs, but there has not yet been enough time to judge the effects of their efforts. As an example, the AIIB has been innovative in the field of infrastructure financing, and obviously it's difficult to keep up with the demand in infrastructure lending. The bank announced that with Clifford Capital would begin buying and repackaging infrastructure loans for sale in tranches through the Bayfront Infrastructure Venture. And this has been backed by Amundi, DBS Bank, John Hancock, and it's been labeled as a creative concept to benefit from financial flows in the realm of infrastructure. So that's very promising. In addition, earlier this year in September, I believe the AIIB and the Amundi have announced the launch of their climate change investment framework, which was endorsed by the Climate Bonds Initiative. And that translates the goals of the Paris Agreement into metrics that investments can be held against. And the framework is taking a holistic approach that the current private capital mobilization efforts lack, by addressing climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and contribution equally in the metrics, and adjusting a portfolio or issuers response as time goes on. So our overall recommendation on this metric would be, given the AIIB's focus on infrastructure and the current work with MDB working groups, there is a potential for the bank to be a leader amongst public development banks for climate-friendly and sustainable infrastructure metrics and definitions, in particular in its key infrastructure strategy areas such as cities, water, energy, and digital. I will pause here, but again, I'm happy to pick up on any questions people have specific to the AIIB. Back to you, Sonia. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, and really interesting to hear that analysis of AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, based in Beijing, founded only 5 years ago, in many ways a post-Paris Agreement bank with a mission to be lean, clean and green, and really interesting to see how they're doing on the different metrics of Paris alignment. They are, of course, different. Every MDB is different and unique, has a different business model. Some focus on more on infrastructure projects, some do a lot of technical assistance and sort of knowledge bank work, but very interesting to see. Please do put your questions. If you have questions, and I hope to see many of them, please do put them in the Q&A box. We're very keen to answer your questions. As you can see, we can also, by the way, do private webinars for your organization, your bank, your government, if that is of interest, zooming in and focusing in on the areas and banks that are most of interest to you. So let us know if you want us to do a private bespoke webinar for your organization. And now I want to hand over to my colleague Johannes Schruten, who is our point person on African Development Bank. As you can tell, within our team at E3G, we have someone who follows each of the major multilateral and bilateral development banks. So we are our in-house specialist on African Development Bank, who's going to be presenting the results of our analysis on that. So Johannes, over to you. I'll let you share your screen.
Thank you very much, Sonia. 1 second, just have to find the right tab. There you go. I hope everyone can see my screen now. So for the African Development Bank, I think what has to be mentioned first is that indeed the only multilateral development bank that is exclusively active in Africa. And what we can see from our assessment is indeed that this implies that they have been, that the AfDB has been a leader in a couple of areas which are particular challenges to the African continent, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa. And I will go into that in a bit. Overall, I think what we can see from AfDB is a bit of a mixed picture. There are areas, as I said, where they're really good, and indeed probably the most innovative one amongst MDBs. But there are other areas where they clearly need to improve, and where there are some areas where we would need to see more ambition in order to be really considered Paris aligned. So yeah, as I said, if you're looking at the color table, you can see it's sort of like a lot of green in there, a lot of yellow, but also a couple of red areas, which indeed, as Sonia already mentioned, are also always up for reconsideration as soon as new policies, new programs come available, and then we are always very happy to reassess our assessments there and improve the score if relevant. On the recommendations that we have formulated overall for African Development Bank, I think one of the major ones, indeed something we see throughout many MDBs, is setting a clear target for when AfDB wants to be Paris aligned. Putting this into stone and then reporting against this target, updating on the progress on the path towards Paris alignment. We would also need a larger fossil fuel exclusion policy that is more comprehensive. I will go into that in more detail in a bit. African Development Bank does do some work on nature-based solutions, but I think we just saw that where ADB stands on this, for instance, I think there are areas where AfDB could do more, especially when it comes to integrating nature-based solutions, sort of as a complete addition to project assessment and looking where nature-based solutions could be of value. There are issues such as cooling, for instance, where this can definitely come in hand. AfDB should also improve its work on energy efficiency. Again, I will get to that, and we will see that that AfDB is very good at energy access, providing energy access or fostering energy access, but lacks some work on energy efficiency. And again, I will go into a deep dive on that. And lastly, we believe that AfDB could also expand its greenhouse gas accounting and the respective reporting. But as I already said, we do see that there are areas where AfDB is really a leader. And there is indeed the climate risk screening and adaptation finance. Again, I will go into a deep dive on this one, but I want to already say that this is really an area where AfDB has proven to be well ahead and really driving innovation amongst MDBs. And indeed, AfDB is the only one who's amongst the MDBs who has managed to fulfill the target, or indeed exceeding the target of balancing adaptation against mitigation finance, making 55% of its climate finance resources to adaptation and 45% to mitigation. That is clearly leadership amongst MDBs. Talking about fossil fuel exclusion policies, I think the main issue here is indeed that some things which have already been sort of implemented on a ad hoc and sort of traditional basis have not been put into policies, and therefore we cannot consider this yet for our assessment here. Although I want to say that for coal policies we have given a bit of a benefit of the doubt, because indeed AfDB hasn't been financing coal for, I think, at least 5, if not 10 years, if I remember correctly. And the president of AfDB has publicly clearly stated that there will be no coal-fired power stations or any other coal investment be provided by AfDB. Nonetheless, the policy or the AfDB lacks a clear official policy statement that commits it to being not financing coal anymore. So this would be something we would definitely recommend for AfDB to come up with. And this could also cover, while they exclude upstream oil and gas, that could also go into the areas of downstream oil and gas power stations, looking into, you know, what can be excluded there, what should be excluded there. There's this project in Mozambique where AfDB is involved, which we would not consider to be Paris aligned, and therefore would clearly recommend that AfDB comes up with a more ambitious policy here in order to be considered really Paris aligned and not just on some progress. However, as already said, looking at climate risk resilience and adaptation, we consider AfDB indeed to be Paris aligned and indeed one of the leaders amongst the MDBs. I already mentioned briefly that the AfDB has exceeded its adaptation finance target, providing 55% of its climate finance for adaptation purposes. And as I said, this is indeed leadership amongst MDBs. But this goes deeper than just providing the finance, because indeed AfDB has come up with innovative tools such as the adaptation benefit mechanism, which really drive integration of adaptation considerations throughout its lending and provides a sort of really providing the economic case for why adaptation is sensible in certain areas. And we can sense that, as already mentioned, this is Africa being probably one of the most vulnerable continent to the impacts of climate change. This is really an area where it makes sense for the AfDB to focus on, and indeed which probably is one of the major challenges for the continent. So it absolutely makes sense that AfDB is driving this discussion and is providing such innovative elements here. I would also like to mention here the Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program and the African Development Bank and African Risk Capacity Agency, who are jointly collaborating on this. So overall, I think what you can see is not just the aim of, you know, providing the necessary adaptation finance, but going beyond that and really integrating it throughout its lending operations and also driving this in the countries African Development Bank is cooperating with. So yeah, I think on this account we can clearly see that AfDB is a leader. I will just very briefly mention energy efficiency, where we indeed consider AfDB probably the area where it needs to be made the largest steps ahead in order to improve here, because indeed energy efficiency has not been really considered yet amongst its operations. There's a large lack of any policies to be found. We can see that for transport energy efficiency, for instance, avoid, shift, improve framework is not being applied, which is sort of a standard framework by now on transport lending. So overall, there's a lot of improvement needed, but indeed we consider, and I think there was a question regarding this, which you might answer in the Q&A afterwards a bit more in detail, but we can see that the issue of energy efficiency is maybe not that pressing yet for the countries AfDB is operating in, whereas other areas are much more urgent. And indeed, this is the one I would like to present last on AfDB before I hand back to Sonia. And that is indeed energy access and fuel poverty, where Africa, of course, facing perhaps the biggest challenge. I believe in sub-Saharan Africa, 43%, I think it's only 43% have access to energy on a regular basis. So we clearly see that this is the major issue. And indeed, as I already mentioned before, because this is probably the challenge that is most applicable to AfDB's lending, this is where they are again Paris aligned and doing a really good job. So they have set ambitious targets, setting 57 million off-grid connections by 2025 in the context of its New Deal on Energy for Africa program. This will also be expanded further into clean cooking elements and so on. There is a good monitoring progress in place where Africa Development Bank is also reporting against this. And we can also see sort of what the minimum definition of access is, where we consider AfDB leading. And this also very much relates to the work that AfDB is doing together with the Sustainable Energy for All in Africa and the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, where we can clearly see that this is going beyond what other MDBs are necessarily doing, perhaps also because it's not necessarily as much of an issue for them as it is for African Development Bank. So overall, I just want to reiterate that we clearly see that African Development Bank is leading on areas which are just very much a challenge for the African continent, and perhaps is trailing a bit on areas which are not as pressing yet. But we want to also state here clearly that these areas will become more important as we go, as Africa will develop, and therefore would clearly urge AfDB to become also a leader in these areas and sort of anticipate already the change that is about to come on the African continent. And with that, I want to hand back to Sonia, being conscious of time.
Thank you, Johannes. Yes, and just because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to just, without further ado, quickly hand over back to Zach Malik. You've heard a lot from him, who's going to briefly, if you don't mind, present on Islamic Development Bank, and then we'll definitely try and answer all the questions. So Zach, if you could present Islamic Development Bank and leave a bit of time for questions, that would be great. Zach, over to you.
Thanks, Sonia. Hope no one's tired of my voice. But yeah, so I want to just quickly present on Islamic Development Bank. This is the bank sort of focused on Islamic finance, and it exists to sort of better serve Muslims in member and non-member countries. Quickly, sort of the Islamic Development Bank has been recognized to have some progress across several metrics. There are, however, a number of metrics that E3G could not assess. This is because the Islamic Development Bank normally report or publish information on them. This list includes, but not limited to, level of transparency, nature-based solutions, and internal carbon pricing. Where the bank is performing well is its technical assistance to its member countries in implementing the Paris Agreement. Conversely, two areas to prioritize, would be setting energy efficiency standards and carrying out GHG accounting at project and portfolio level. So in this context, there are a couple of recommendations that we propose. One should be to commit a specific energy efficiency standard, explicitly provide information on GHG accounting, and sort of put in place a dedicated system level resilience strategy. And the bank should include an NDC, a nationally determined contribution ambition, in its reverse linkage philosophy of technical cooperation framework to help member countries reach their fair share of contributions. So I just want to quickly focus on a couple of metrics. First one being nature-based solutions. So as we said, this is kind of an area where it's difficult to understand what what the bank has been doing on it, and therefore we've assessed it as unaligned. So there doesn't seem to be any commitment to deforestation for green finance lending, but no evidence of areas of nature-based solutions. Having said that, under the bank's sustainable finance framework, all operations are subject to the SDGs, and in particular, the following exclusions apply to the ISDB green and social financing, so any activities involving deforestation, palm oil related activities. So obviously we want this to be expanded in scope to cover all of the bank's financing and operations. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's been a bit of a struggle, or at the moment, it's unclear whether or not there's public information available, and therefore some of the metrics we found at the moment would need further updating as and when public information becomes available and public. Quickly on agriculture, they're doing a lot in terms of having a policy to begin with, and it recognizes the linkages between the change through both mitigation and adaptation. And obviously they understand that many countries, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa region, have limited human and a weak institutional capacity to innovate and build resilient agricultural systems. And this needs to be sort of addressed in a concerted manner, with the intention that the bank will be leading on this. And just lastly, obviously, we're still seeking clarification from the bank on its commitments in regard to biodiversity. And just to wrap up, just to sort of end on a positive note, the bank is doing really well on technical assistance for implementing Paris goals. So partnership with the ISDB, with parties in place to provide NDC and non-NDC technical assistance. They're implementing partner of the NDC partnership. They provide NDC assistance in integrating into approach to country work. And they're obviously helping its member countries to raise increased NDC ambition, as well as sort of helping non-NDC technical assistance. And so I guess as an example of this, recently the bank carried out these sort of NDC packages or technical assistance for Lebanon and Palestine. And so this is just sort of increased ambition and implementation of their NDCs. And if you want, in your own time, look into the country work metric to explore further exactly how this played out. And just to end, obviously, the bank just needs to sort of integrate its NDC ambition into its reverse linkage ideology, just to really make sure that these countries are sort of kept under the IPCC 1.5 degrees scenario compatibility. I will leave it there. I'm sorry that if that was a bit rushed, but I'm happy to pick up on any questions on this bank as well. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Zach. And indeed, Islamic Development Bank is a bank that we've only really just started analysing. And so we're keen to do more, and we'd happy to do a whole 1-hour webinar just on Islamic Development Bank if there was interest. So now I just want to come to some of the questions that have been asked in the last 5 minutes of this webinar before we say goodbye for the day. So the first question that came in was from Augustine in Jamnishi. Hi, Augustine. And the question is, are the Paris Agreement alignment metrics, the yardsticks, the same for all MDBs, or is there differentiation between developed country MDBs and developing country MDBs? And that's a very good question. The methodological approach that we have always taken over the last 3 years is that where this is can be used as a comparative analysis across the different multilateral development banks, and therefore we have applied the same criteria and the same yardsticks, the same metrics and the same definitions of the levels of Paris alignment to all the different multilateral development banks, and indeed also to the bilateral development banks that we have assessed. When we think a metric is clearly just not appropriate for a bank, we have marked it as white or not available or not applicable, as is the case for a number of metrics, for a number of banks. We have acknowledged, and Johannes obviously made this particularly clear in his presentation on African Development Bank, that in some cases, you know, certain issues are not as relevant or is not as salient for specific regions, and we have sought to acknowledge that in the detail of our analysis. But the idea is that this is a tool for governments and others to use to be able to compare across banks, and therefore we have used the same yardsticks for the different institutions. Then I see that Sandeep Patel has asked a question about funding or systems for R&D, for research and development, and for piloting of green technologies and building green technology and R&D ecosystems. This is an area actually that we have not covered so far in our analysis, but is something where we have a lot of in-house expertise at E3G, and we're keen to cover in the future. So please do get in touch if you would like to be involved in that. We would be keen to work with you. And happy to also give you the floor if we have time at the end. I see there's also been a question that's come in from Laurie van der Burg from Oil Change International, asking about how campaigners, investors, government officials, bank officials can use this as a resource to drive change at the institutions. I mean, there's lots of ways it can be used, but fundamentally it's about translating the technical and the obscure into the easy to understand and the simple to grasp, right? We've tried to do this analysis, delve into these often very densely worded documents and translate that into a simple traffic light system. And of course that requires some simplification, but as a traffic light system that shows green, orange, red, how these banks are doing on the different areas. And that allows campaigners and government officials and bank officials to get a feel for where they should probably be prioritizing and putting more resources, and where they're doing relatively well and can be sharing best practice, right? So it's about, you know, if you're a government shareholder of an MDB, you can go into a meeting and say, look, I hear, bank, that you are not doing well on energy access. Can you tell us more? And what's your plan to improve this, for example? And thereby helping to bring more transparency and to bring more greater awareness to this across the board. And indeed, you know, we're always engaging with these banks and looking for opportunities to make progress as well. And then finally, there was just a question on where to find the different parts of information. So I just wanted to share my screen once more, just to show you once more. So if you go to the cover page of the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix and you scroll down, if you want to see, for example, detailed information on, somebody asked, the fossil fuel exclusion policies at ADB. So ADB is this first column here. You scroll down to fossil fuel exclusion policies, click on that box, that orange box, and that brings you to the detailed page with the detailed summary and then detailed explanation on that metric. If you go back to the overall summary table, then you can also click on, let's say, African Development Bank up here at the top. I hope you can see my mouse, and that takes you to the overview page where you can see some background on that bank and then the overall summary of that bank. So I hope that clarifies things. We're constantly going to be improving this website as well. We know there are areas that could be made clearer, and so we will be continually improving it over the next years. So we've hit 9 o'clock GMT. I know many of you probably need to go. I want to say thank you once again for joining us. I hope we were able to answer your questions in part, if not in full. Do use this as a resource, bookmark it, come back to it. Let us know if you have any comments. Let us know if you have any feedback. Let us know if you want to get involved in some way. We're very keen to work with you. And thank you for joining this webinar this morning. Hope you have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, and look forward to seeing you soon on another E3G webinar. So my name's Sonia Dunlop, and from myself and the rest of the team, good morning. Thank you very much, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.